The glacier gives things back. Not quickly, and never when you ask for them, but it gives them back. On the 11th of September, I stood at the edge of the outwash plain with a plastic bag in one hand and a boot inside the bag. It was a Danner, size 12, the leather bleached to the color of old paper, the stitching gone soft as wet bread. The heel was worn down on the outside edge, in the particular way a heavy man wears down a boot. Meltwater had carried it out from under the terminus sometime during the night and left it in the gravel the way the ocean leaves a shell. The tag inside the tongue had dissolved. The lace was still tied. 9 seasons I had been working the Mendenhall Glacier Recreation Area for the Forest Service, and in 9 seasons the ice had handed me a rusted Coleman lantern, 400 feet of hemp rope, a Kodak camera from the 1930s with the film still inside, and the intact skull of a mountain goat that had gone into a crevasse before my grandfather was born. Every object came out of the same mouth. Every object arrived without an explanation. I logged the boot at 8:52 in the morning, photographed it against a ruler on the tailgate of the truck, and wrote the coordinates in the incident book. Then I carried it up to the visitor center and set it on the counter in front of Martha Cox. Martha had been here 22 years. She was 48 years old, built like a fence post, and she had a way of looking at a thing for a long time before she said anything about it, which is a habit you acquire when you spend 2 decades answering the same 9 questions from 600,000 people a year. She looked at the boot. She did not touch it. "Where?" she said. "200 meters east of the face, below the seep line." "Alone?" "Alone." She turned the bag over with a pen. The gray light coming through the observation windows lay flat on the plastic. Behind her, out past the glass, the Mendenhall lay in the valley the way it always lay. 4,000 feet across at the face, blue in the fractures, filthy white where the summer had worked on it, and the lake in front of it carrying its little fleet of broken bergs toward the outflow. Nugget Falls came down off the eastern wall in a white thread. 200 visitors were out on the photo point taking the same photograph that has been taken 10 million times. 1993, Martha said, or 1987. Both of those were men. Both of those were big men. You remember the file numbers off the top of your head. I remember the families, she said. That is the part the brochures leave out. The Mendenhall is the most visited glacier in North America, and it is also a machine that has been eating people at a slow and dependable rate since we started counting. Not many, 1 every few years. People go out onto the ice without crampons, or they walk under a calving face to get a photograph, or they go into a cave in July when the roof is running like a faucet. The ice is not hostile. The ice is simply larger than any decision you can make inside of it. I believe that entirely. I had said it to visitors 400 times. I said it that season too, right up until the morning of the 29th of September. And then I stopped saying it, and I have not said it since. Here is the thing about a retreating glacier that nobody outside the work really understands. The Mendenhall has been pulling back for 250 years. In my 9 seasons alone, it withdrew far enough that the trail signage had to be moved 3 separate times, and Nugget Falls, which used to pour directly onto the ice, now pours onto bare rock and runs into open water. Every year the ice lets go of a little more ground. Every year a strip of land that has not seen the sky since before the American Revolution comes out into the air, wet and gray and steaming, and things that were under there come out with it. We think of that as recovery. We film it and we put it in the interpretive displays, and we talk about pioneer plant species and the succession of alder and cottonwood and spruce. What we do not talk about is that the ice was also a lid. The tracks showed up 4 days after the boot. Zachary Howard found them. Zachary was 30 years old, and it was his first season with us. A seasonal trail technician out of Bellingham, all forearms and enthusiasm. The kind of young man who volunteers for the worst assignment in the rain because he has not yet learned that the rain does not stop in October. He had been running the brush saw along the East Glacier Loop, and he came down the trail at a jog with his radio in his hand instead of on his belt, which is how I knew before he opened his mouth. "You need to see this," he said, "and I need you to tell me I am wrong about it." He took me up past the switchbacks to the overlook spur where the trail runs out onto a shelf of polished bedrock. Below the shelf there is a slope of glacial flour, a fine gray silt that comes off the ice and settles wherever the runoff slows down. It holds an impression better than plaster. I have taken casts of wolf tracks out of that silt so clean you could count the toe pads. There were 11 prints in a line, running from the water at the bottom of the slope up toward the alder at the top. They were not bare. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds, and because for 9 years I had been the person at the counter who gently explained to visitors that the enormous track they photographed was a brown bear print with the toes melted out by sun. I had a laminated card for it. I could do the whole speech in 90 seconds. A brown bear track has claw marks. It has an asymmetrical pad. The hind print overlays the foreprint in a way that creates the illusion of a single long foot, and that illusion is where 90% of the reports come from. I knew all of it. I knelt in the silt with my tape out and I applied every part of it, and none of it worked. Length, 17 1/4 inches. Width across the ball, 7 1/2. 5 toes, all forward. The great toe largest, the outer toes small and slightly splayed, no claws of any kind. There was a pronounced double ball, a crease running across the midfoot as if the whole structure flexed there. The depth of the impression in the silt was 3 1/8 inches at the heel. Zachary weighed 185 pounds, and standing on one foot in the same silt he left an impression barely deeper than a thumbnail. The stride was 52 inches. I measured it 4 times because I did not believe it. I am 5'10", and my comfortable stride is about 30 inches. To match 52, I had to lunge like a man crossing a stream on stepping stones, and I could not have kept it up for 11 consecutive paces up a slope. "Somebody made those," Zachary said. He said it the way you say a thing you want somebody else to agree with. With what? I do not know. Boards, a frame. People do this. Show me where they got on and off the slope. He walked the perimeter for 11 minutes. There was nothing. The silt was unbroken for 40 feet in every direction around that line of prints except at the bottom, where the water was, and at the top, where the alder started. Whatever made them came out of the lake and went into the brush, and it did not stop to admire the view. We cast 3 of them. I have the casts in a plastic tote in my garage, and I have not shown them to more than 4 people in my life. That night I pulled the incident archive. Martha had been right about the file numbers. There were 2 drownings in the 80s, and 1 presumed fall in 93. All of them men, all of them large, all of them recovered, or presumed lost within a mile of the terminus. That was not what stopped me. What stopped me was a single line item filed under nuisance wildlife in October of 1962, written in fountain pen, signed by a district ranger who had been dead for 30 years. It read as follows: Party of 3 at West Glacier Shelter reports vocalization and displacement of stored food. Structure damaged at doorframe. Height of damage 6 feet 8 inches. Party evacuated at own request 0400 hours. No bear sign located. Recommend seasonal closure. Underneath, in a different hand, in pencil, somebody had written 4 words that were not part of any official reporting format I have ever been trained on. It is back again. There is a sound the Mendenhall makes that has a name in the literature, and there is a sound it makes that does not. The first one is calving. When a slab lets go of the face and drops into the lake, it produces a report you feel in your sternum from a mile away. A hollow gunshot followed by a long grinding sigh as the ice settles into the water. Visitors love it. They wait all day for it. There is also the internal noise, the groans and cracks that travel up through the body of the glacier when it moves against its bed. And on a still night in the valley you can lie in your bunk and listen to 500 million tons of ice complaining about gravity. I knew those sounds the way you know the sound of your own house settling. The second sound started on the 21st of September, and it did not come from the ice. Deborah Ward heard it before I did. Deborah was 53, flew a Eurocopter for one of the tour outfits out of the Juneau airport, and had put in 11 years in rotary wing before that, in places she declined to discuss over a beer. She was the single most unflappable human being I have ever worked alongside. She had put a helicopter down on the dry lake bed in a whiteout with 9 tourists aboard, and then walked back through the cabin apologizing for the inconvenience. She came into the visitor center in the last hour of the light with her sunglasses still on her head and asked me to step outside. "I need you to listen to something," she said, "and I need you to not do the ranger face at me." She played it off her phone. It was 4 minutes of recording made from the open door of the aircraft while she waited on the pad for a passenger transfer. And for the first 3 minutes of it there was nothing but rotor tick and wind. Then, at 3 minutes and 11 seconds, underneath everything, there was a sound. I do not have a good comparison. The closest thing I can give you is a sound halfway between a bull moose and a woman screaming into a barrel. But that is not it either, because it went on too long, and because it changed pitch in the middle, in a way an animal call does not usually change. It started low enough that the phone microphone barely caught it, climbed through something like a howl, and then broke apart into a series of short, flat barks that stopped all at once, as though something had closed a door. Then, 8 seconds later, the same sound came again from a different direction. Farther east, higher up the valley. "That is two," Deborah said. "That is an echo. I have been flying this valley for 11 years. I know what the walls do with sound." She took the phone back and put it in her jacket. "That is two, and they are talking to each other, and they are on either side of the West Glacier Trail." I did the ranger face at her anyway, because that was my job, and because a part of me was already running through the list of things that could produce that recording. A malfunctioning refrigeration compressor at one of the pads, a goat in distress, somebody with a speaker and too much free time, which happens more than you would think in a place with this much cryptid tourism attached to it. There is a gift shop in Juneau that sells 3 different styles of the tall figure walking on a t-shirt. It is a joke here. It has been a joke here since before I was born. I stopped doing the ranger face 2 nights later when I heard it myself from the porch of the ranger residence at 2:40 in the morning, and understood in about a second and a half why the phone had failed to capture what it actually was. The recording had missed the bottom of it. In person, the low part of that call is not a sound at all. It is a pressure. You feel it in the small bones of your face before you hear anything. The way you feel a subwoofer through a wall, and then the audible part arrives on top of that and your whole body decides, without consulting you, that it would like to be inside a building with a locked door. I have been within 30 feet of a sow brown bear with cubs. I have had a bull moose come through a campsite at a dead run. Neither one did to me what that sound did. Those are animals, and your body knows what to do about an animal. Your body has 10,000 generations of instruction about an animal. This was something my body had no instruction for, and so it simply stopped, the way a car stops when you pull the key out at speed. It lasted maybe 9 seconds. Afterward, the whole valley was silent. Not quiet, silent. No thrush, no gull down at the lake. Not one of the ravens that live in the cottonwoods behind the maintenance shed and never shut up about anything. I stood on that porch in my long underwear with a mug of coffee going cold in my hand for 11 minutes, and I did not hear a single living thing. If you have gotten this far and something about this valley is starting to sit wrong with you, do me the small favor of tapping the like button and leaving a comment telling me whether you would have stayed on that porch or gone inside. I read every one of them. Subscribing helps these accounts reach the people who need to hear them. The next morning I drove out to see Pamela Peterson. Pamela was 64 and had spent 31 years as a dispatcher for the district before she retired, which meant that for 3 decades every radio call in this valley had passed through her ears. She lived out on the back loop with a wood stove going year-round and a wall of 3 ring binders that she was not technically supposed to have. I told her about the tracks. I told her about the recording. I did not tell her about the pencil line in the 62 file, because I wanted to see if she would arrive there on her own. She poured coffee and let me finish, and then she sat down across from me and said, "How far back has the face pulled since you started?" The question was not what I expected. About 600 meters, give or take, and in my time it was better than a mile. She turned her cup around on the table. You want the part they do not put in the displays. Every time this valley opens up a new piece of ground, we get a run of it. 62, 79, 87, 93, 2006. And then it goes quiet for a while, and everyone decides it was teenagers, and then the ice lets go of some more ground, and it starts again. That is a coincidence. It might be. She said it without any heat at all, which was worse than if she had argued. Or the thing about a glacier is that it is a wall, and a wall does not care whether you think it is a wall. There is country up behind that ice that nobody has ever walked. Not the mining people, not the survey people, not the Tlingit before them, because it was under 2,000 feet of ice, and there was nothing up there to walk to. Now there is a way through, and there are things on the other side of it that have been going about their business without us for a very long time. And they are coming down. They have always come down, Pamela said. They just have farther to come. She got up and pulled a binder off the shelf without having to look for it, which told me she had pulled it recently, and set it in front of me open to a page. It was a photocopy of a photocopy. A page from an oral history project done in the 70s. An interview with a man born in 1891 who had worked the gold operations at the head of the valley as a boy. I will not reproduce his words here because they belong to him and to his family. The substance of it was this. The old people did not go up past the ice. There was a name for what was up there, and the name was not used casually. And it was not a joke, and it was not a story for children. The rule was simple, and it was absolute. You did not take anything from up there. If you took something, it would come down and take something back, and it would not be in a hurry about it, and it would not take the thing you offered. I closed the binder. Whose boot was that? Pamela said. I did not have an answer for her. I still do not. By the last week of September, the visitor numbers had dropped off the way they always do once the cruise season ends. Juneau empties out in the fall like a bathtub. 900,000 people come through in the summer, and then one October morning you look around the observation deck and there are 4 people on it and 3 of them work here. That is the season I like. It is also the season when the valley stops performing for an audience and goes back to being what it actually is. Scott Torres arrived on the 24th. He was 46, a field specialist attached to a university ice monitoring program, and he had been coming up to the Mendenhall twice a year for 11 years to service a network of instruments that sit on and around the glacier and measure things I only half understand: surface velocity, basal water pressure, the seismic signature of the ice as it moves. He was small and precise, and he had the least alarming personality of anyone I have ever met, which is why what happened to him mattered so much to how the rest of it went. He set up in the seasonal quarters, and on his second evening he knocked on my door with a laptop under his arm, and an expression I did not like. "Do you have a landfill in this valley?" he said. "No. Compressors, generators, anything running continuously at low frequency. The center has HVAC. That is it." He set the laptop on my table and turned it toward me. It was a spectrogram, a scrolling image where time runs left to right and frequency runs bottom to top, and loud things show up bright. "This is the geophone array," he said. 3 units on the moraine, 2 on the ice. They are there to catch ice quakes and calving events. This is the last 6 nights. Most of the image was the mess I would have expected. Bursts and smears where the glacier had done something. But running through the bottom of it, in the range below what a human ear registers as sound, there were pulses, regular ones. They came in groups of 4 to 7. They lasted between 8 and 14 seconds each, and there were long gaps between the groups. "Infrasound," Scott said. "Between 11 and 18 hertz. Well below hearing. Ice does that. Ice does that when it fractures, and when it does, all 5 units record the same event with a time offset I can use to locate the source. That is the whole point of an array." He tapped the screen. "These are not arriving at all 5. Some nights it is 3 units, some nights it is 1, and the source location moves. Between Tuesday and Thursday it moved 4 kilometers down valley, and then 2 kilometers back up." I looked at the screen for a while. "You are telling me it walks." "I am telling you the source of the emission changes position between events. What I say in a report is that we have an unresolved low-frequency source with a variable location. What I say in your kitchen is that something in this valley is producing sustained infrasound, and it is moving. And on Thursday night it produced a group of 6 pulses from a position about 300 meters from where you and I are currently sitting." Neither of us said anything for a moment. The window over the sink was black and had our reflection in it. "There is a thing about infrasound," Scott said, and I could hear him trying to keep it dry. "At those frequencies you do not hear it, but the body responds. Chest pressure, nausea, a sense of being watched. It has been documented in a dozen contexts. Some large animals produce it. Elephants use it to communicate over distance because low frequencies carry through terrain that stops everything else." "And you can produce it deliberately," I said. "If you were the thing producing it, you could use it to move something, push it a direction." "That is not in the literature," Scott said carefully. "Neither is anything else about this." The next morning, the four of us went out to close the ice caves. That was already on the schedule, in fairness. The caves under the West Lobe are the most photographed feature in southeast Alaska, and they are also the most reliable way to be killed here. In September, the roofs are unstable. The meltwater channels are running full, and every year we lose count of the people who wander in with a phone light and no understanding that 100 tons of ice does not creak before it comes down. We were going in to hang the seasonal closure signage at the mouths and photograph the condition of each entrance for the file. Martha came because she always came. Zachary came because he had never been in one. Scott came because he had 2 instruments to pull off the West Lobe, and it was on the way. We went in through the lower mouth a little after 10 in the morning, which is the safest time, and for about 40 minutes it was the thing that makes people fly 4,000 miles. I have been in those caves perhaps 60 times, and it has never once stopped working on me. You go through a low entrance in dirty gray ice, and then the passage opens and the whole world turns blue. Not painted blue, lit blue, from every direction, as though the ice is a lamp with its source somewhere far above you, because that is more or less what it is. The ceiling is fluted and rippled where water has worked it into shapes like the inside of a shell. There is a stream in the floor with rocks in it that have not seen the sky in 1,000 years. Everything drips. The sound of the drip comes from everywhere at once, and it makes a kind of music that people go quiet in the presence of. Zachary stood in the middle of it with his mouth open and forgot to take a photograph, which is the highest compliment the place ever gets. Martha found it first. She had gone ahead maybe 40 meters to check the constriction where the passage narrows before the second chamber, and she came back around the bend walking in a way I did not recognize, and she said, quietly, "I need everyone to stop talking." The smell hit me before I got to her. I want to describe this accurately because it is the detail that convinced me more than the tracks and more than the recording. It was not a rotten smell. Rot, I know. Every ranger knows rot. This was something else. It was a wet animal smell with something chemical underneath it, sharp and ammoniac, like a cage that has not been cleaned, and beneath that a sweetness that made the back of my throat close. It was so thick in that constriction that it had a shape. You walked into it the way you walk into a wall of heat coming off a parking lot. 4 steps back, and it was gone. 4 steps forward, and you were standing in it. Cold air holds smell. Cold, still, saturated air holds it for a long time. Whatever had put that smell there had been standing in that passage recently enough that the air had not yet moved it. And at the base of the constriction, pressed into the layer of silt where the meltwater had slowed, was a single print. Not a full one. The forward 2/3 of a bare foot with 5 toes and no claws, coming out of the second chamber and heading toward the mouth we had just walked in through. Scott, who had not said a word since we entered, crouched next to it and did not touch it. Then he stood up and pointed his headlamp back the way the print was going, down the passage toward daylight, and said the only unprofessional thing I ever heard him say. "That is behind us now." We went out fast. We did not go into the second chamber. We did not hang the signage, and we did not pull Scott's instruments. We went out into the gray morning and stood on the ice apron in the rain, and none of us wanted to be the first one to speak. Zachary spoke. "I left my pack," he said. It was sitting where he had set it down at the entrance to take a photograph, 12 meters back inside the mouth, in plain view. Bright orange. He could see it from where we stood. I said no. I want that on the record, for whatever a record is worth now. I said no, and Martha said no, and Zachary laughed and said we were all being ridiculous, and it was 12 meters and his truck keys were in it, and he went in. He was gone for 11 seconds. I counted them without deciding to. He came out at a walk, with the pack in his hand, and his face had gone the color of the ice. "Somebody," he said. "Somebody is in there." "What did you see?" I did not see anything. He was not looking at us. He was looking at the mouth of the cave. I picked up my bag and something in there breathed out, right behind me, close enough that I felt it on my neck. We stood in the rain looking at a hole in a glacier. "It was warm," Zachary said. We closed the caves that afternoon by regulation, and I closed the West Glacier Trail by discretion, which is a thing a ranger can do for a limited period if there is a hazard he can articulate. I articulated unstable ice and aggressive wildlife. Both of those were true in the way a lie is sometimes assembled entirely out of true parts. Then I did the thing I had been avoiding for a week. I went looking. Deborah flew me. She had a 2-hour window between transfers on the 27th, and she took the machine up the valley at 400 feet with the door off, and me in the left seat with binoculars and a camera. Below us, the Mendenhall ran up into the mountains, the way a road runs into a fog bank, blue and white and folded. The medial moraine drawn down the middle of it like a seam in cloth. Crevice fields on the west side, a chaos of blocks near the icefall. Above all of it, the Juneau icefield went on for 1,500 square miles, which is a number that means nothing to you until you are looking at it out of an open door. That is the part people do not hold in their heads when they argue about this. They picture a forest. They picture a place with a boundary and roads around it and a manageable interior. The country behind the Mendenhall is larger than the state of Rhode Island, and there is not one road in it. There are ridges up there that no human foot has ever touched. Not because they are secret, because there has never been any reason for a person to go, and because the weather up there will kill you 11 months out of 12. Something could live in that country and never once cross a trail. We flew up the west lateral moraine, that long ridge of rubble the glacier has been piling against the valley wall for 2 centuries. And it was Deborah who saw it. She did not point. She banked, which is a pilot's way of pointing, and brought us around in a slow left turn. 9 o'clock, she said in the headset. Below the tree line. Tell me what I am looking at. There were 7 of them. Stone cairns, each one about 4 feet high, standing in a rough line along a bench in the moraine where the ground flattened before it dropped to the ice. 7 stacks in a line, at intervals of maybe 18 meters, each one built out of the rounded cobbles that lie loose all over that ground by the million. Cairns are not remarkable in themselves. People build them. Route markers, summit registers, tourists with nothing to do. I have knocked down more than I can count because they confuse hikers. These were not built by a person with 2 hands and a normal reach. I got the photographs, and we landed later, and I walked up to them on foot the next day. 4 hours up through alder that fought me for every meter, and stood in front of the 3rd one from the north end and understood what I was looking at. The base stones were large. Not large in the way a strong man can manage. The bottom rock in that cairn was an oblate cobble, roughly the size of a kitchen sink. And when I put my back into it with both hands and everything my knees had, I moved it about 2 inches. There were 4 more like it in that structure, and they had been placed, not rolled, because rolled stones leave a track in the moss, and there were no tracks. And they had been placed on top of one another to a height above my own head with a wedging technique that was, and I say this with the full weight of 9 seasons of building rock structures for the Forest Service, better than mine. At the base of the 4th cairn there was a bundle. It was alder. 6 or 7 live green stems, each about the thickness of my wrist, taken from a stand 30 feet away and twisted together into a knot at the height of about 6.5 feet, then bent down and woven back into themselves. Green alder that size does not bend, it splits. You need a tool and leverage and a great deal of patience. These stems had been wrung like a wet towel, and the fibers were pulled apart along the twist in long white splinters, and the breaks were fresh enough to still be wet with sap. I photographed everything. I did not touch the bundle. Pamela's man, born in 1891, had been very clear about taking things. What I could not stop thinking about was the geometry. 7 cairns in a line along a bench. The line ran roughly north to south. Below the bench, 300 meters down and out on the flat, was the visitor center. The parking lot, the paved loop, the observation deck, the whole apparatus we have built to help 900,000 people a year look at a glacier. The cairns faced us. They were arranged along the exact edge where the ground drops toward everything human in this valley, spaced with an evenness that made my skin move. And I had flown over that bench 40 times in 9 years, and I had never seen them before, because they had not been there before. It was a line on a map. That is what it was. Somebody had drawn a line and put markers on it, and I was standing on the wrong side of it. Scott ran the numbers that night on the infrasound. He had gone back through the archive of the array as far as it went, 6 years, and he had built a plot of the events by month. "There is nothing in the record before this August," he said. "Not one. Then 11 events in August, 31 in September, and we are only at the 29th. So it arrived in August, or it started vocalizing in August." He rubbed his eyes. He had not been sleeping. None of us had been sleeping, and I did not fully understand why until later, when I read what sustained low-frequency exposure does to a person over a period of weeks. There is a third possibility that I like less. Go ahead. There is more than one, and this is the first year that they have needed to talk to each other. Martha called at 9:40 that evening from the visitor center. I could hear the alarm panel chirping behind her. Something had come down out of the moraine and across the paved loop and into the service yard between the maintenance shed and the propane cage. It had gotten into the dumpster, which is bear-proof and rated as such, and it had removed the top by disassembling the hinge assembly, which no bear has ever done in the history of this facility. There was a smear of gray silt across the top of the enclosure at a height of 7 feet 3 inches. There were prints in the wet gravel by the drain, 4 of them, the same as the ones on the silt slope and 11% larger. And on the door of the shed, at the height of a man's face, there was a hand. Not a handprint in the sense of a smudge. A hand, in silt, laid flat against the steel and lifted away clean. 4 fingers and a thumb. The palm was 9 inches across. The middle finger measured 7 3/4 inches from the base crease to the tip. The thumb was set lower and rotated in a way that was almost human and was not human, and the finger pads were broad and flattened like the pads of a climbing animal. Martha photographed it. Then, before I got there, she washed it off the door with a hose. And when I asked her why, she said the thing I have thought about more than anything else anybody said to me that autumn. "Because the first bus of the season comes in at 9 tomorrow," she said, "and there are going to be 60 people standing 11 feet from that door, and if I leave it there I have to decide what to tell them. I have been telling people about this valley for 22 years. I do not have a version of this that ends with them getting back on the bus. If any part of this is holding you, hit that like button and tell me down in the comments what you would have done standing at that shed door with a hose in your hand. Follow the channel so the next one finds you." That night I wrote the incident up in the official book in the flattest language I could manage. Property damage, wildlife, suspected bear. I signed it. 9 seasons of a clean and honest record, and I signed a document I knew to be false, and I did it because Martha was right, and because the alternative was a headline, and because a headline in this valley in this decade brings 400 people up that moraine with rifles and camera drones inside of a week. I have made my peace with most of what happened. I have not made my peace with that signature. The storm came in on the 1st of October off the Gulf, which is the direction they all come from, and it was the ordinary kind for this coast. 60-knot gusts at the ridgeline, 3 inches of rain in 18 hours, temperature holding just above freezing so that none of it did the decent thing and turned into snow. The lake went the color of concrete. The falls doubled in volume overnight, and you could hear them from the parking lot over the wind. We had a party out. That is the detail I have gone over 10,000 times. There should not have been a party out. The trail was closed by my own order. But a closure order is a sign on a post, and 3 visitors from a cruise extension had walked around it on the 30th to camp at the West Glacier shelter, and they had not come back on the 1st, and their rental car was still sitting in the lot at the trailhead with a parking receipt on the dash and rain running down the windshield. Deborah could not fly. Nobody could fly. The ceiling was on the deck, and the gusts up the valley were beyond limits. So we walked. 4 of us went in at 4:15 in the afternoon, with the light already failing. Me, Zachary, Scott, and Martha. Pamela stayed at the center on the radio, which is where she had spent 31 years and where she was worth more than any 3 of us in the field. The West Glacier Trail is a little under 7 miles round trip, and it climbs about 1,300 feet through hemlock and spruce along the flank of Mount McGinnis, and in good weather it is one of the finest walks in North America. In 60 knots of wind, with rain coming sideways, it is a tunnel of noise. That is what nobody tells you about a storm in a coastal rainforest. You cannot hear. The wind in the canopy is a continuous roar, and every one of your senses that might warn you of something is switched off. You are walking in a box. We found the party at the shelter at 6:20 in the last of the light, all 3 of them, alive, and I have never been so relieved and so immediately frightened in the same breath. They were inside with the door braced shut with a bench. They had been there since 2 in the morning. Their tents were gone, and I mean gone, not collapsed, not blown out. One of them was recovered 11 days later in a hemlock 40 feet off the ground and 200 meters from the pad, with the poles still in the sleeves and the whole structure knotted around a branch. They had run for the shelter in the rain, and something had come after them, and it had spent the better part of the night circling the building. I got the account from the youngest of them while Scott looked at her hands, which were cut where she had been holding the bench. She said it walked. She said that 4 separate times, unprompted, as if the walking was the part her mind kept snagging on. She said it went around and around, and it never made a sound with its feet, and that twice it hit the wall, one heavy strike flat on with something that was not a fist and was not a shoulder, and the whole shelter jumped. She said that near dawn it stopped and stood at the corner nearest the window for a long time, and she could see a shape against the gray of the sky, and it was tall enough that the top of it was above the frame. I have the shelter dimensions in the maintenance file. The window frame at the west corner has a header at 7 feet 1 inch. We got them out. That was the priority, and that is what we did. We put them in the middle of the file with Martha at the front and me at the back, and we started down at 6:50 into full night, with headlamps that did nothing but light up the rain in front of our faces. It came with us. I want to be careful again. I did not see it on the descent. Not once, not clearly. What I had was this. 3 times in 40 minutes, the wind dropped the way it does in the lee of a ridge, and in those pockets of relative quiet I could hear something moving parallel to us in the timber, 20 or 30 meters upslope, at exactly our pace, not following, escorting. It moved when we moved, and it stopped when we stopped, and I tested that twice by halting the file for no reason, and both times the noise upslope stopped a half-second later, which is the half-second it takes something to react to a change it did not expect. At 7:35, Scott stopped and said the array was going to be recording this and he wanted a timestamp. And while he was writing it in his notebook, the pressure came. It arrived in my chest before it arrived in my ears. Everybody in that line felt it at once. The woman with the cut hands went down on one knee in the mud and put her arms over her head. Then the sound came on top of it, that same rising scream breaking into flat barks, close, 40 meters, upslope and slightly ahead. And it was answered from below us and to the east, from between us and the trailhead, and that second one was closer than the first. There is a moment in this work where the training runs out. Everything I have ever been taught about wildlife encounters assumes an animal that would rather not be near you. Make yourself large, make noise, give it a way out. All of it is built on the premise that you are an inconvenience the animal wants resolved. That premise did not apply on that trail. Whatever was on that slope did not want us to leave. It wanted us to go a particular direction, and it and the other one were putting themselves where they needed to be to make that happen. And I understood in a single cold moment that we were not being hunted. We were being herded. I broke the file. I put everybody in a tight group, and I took them off the trail on the fall line, straight down the slope through Devil's Club and Blowdown, 400 vertical feet of the worst ground in southeast Alaska in the rain and the night, because it was the one direction that had nothing in it. It took us 50 minutes to cover 800 meters. Martha broke 2 fingers on a root. I lost the skin off both palms. We came out on the flat by the lake shore, west of where anything expected us. and we walked out along the water with the wind at our backs and the lights of the visitor center appearing across the flat at 9:24 in the evening like the lights of a ship. Pamela had the door open before we crossed the lot. We were 7 going in, and we came out 7, and I counted us twice in the doorway with the rain running off my hood. And everybody was accounted for, and I remember Zachary laughing at me for counting. He was the last one through the door. At 11:10 that night, after the visitors had been transported and the statements were half written and the coffee was going, Zachary said he was going to move the trucks up from the trailhead lot before the creek came over the culvert, which was a real risk and a sensible thing to do, and a 5-minute drive. I said fine. I did not walk out with him. I did not tell him to take the radio, and he did not take it, because it was 5 minutes, and because he was 30 years old, and because we had all just come down off that mountain alive, and there is a stupid, chemical, glorious feeling that follows a night like that, where the fear turns into something almost like joy, and you believe for about an hour that nothing can touch you. We found his truck at the trailhead at 12:40, with the driver door standing open, and the dome light burning, and the wipers still going. The search ran 19 days. I will not give you the whole of it, because the whole of it is 19 days of the same 4 hours repeated, and because the part that matters can be told in a shorter space. We had 80 people on the ground at the peak, from the Juneau volunteer teams, from the state, from 2 agencies I had never worked with. We had dogs, 4 of them, and 3 of the 4 would not work the trailhead lot at all. They would come out of the vehicle and go straight to the open door of that truck, and then they would sit down and refuse. And the 4th one worked a line for 200 meters up the moraine and then stopped at the bottom of the bench and would not go up. Their handlers had a difficult time explaining this in the debriefs. One of them stopped trying and just said the dog would not. We had helicopters when the weather allowed, with Deborah flying more hours than she was legally permitted and nobody filing anything about it. We had thermal. We had 140 volunteers who put in their own money and their own time in October rain to walk grid lines through Alder for a young man most of them had never met, and I will carry that for the rest of my life as the one clean thing in the whole account. We found 4 items. His headlamp, 60 meters up the moraine from the lot, switched on, the lens cracked, the battery dead where it had run down over an unknown number of hours. 1 boot at 340 meters, on the bench, 11 meters from the northernmost cairn. It was unlaced and undamaged, and it was standing upright on the moss. A section of his rain shell at 600 meters, above the bench in the timber. Not torn. The seams had failed. That is a different thing, and the difference is why I have never been able to sleep properly through an October since. A tear runs across fabric. These seams had come apart along their entire length, both shoulders, as though the garment had been pulled in 2 directions by something that had a grip on both sides of it, and did not consider the fabric to be relevant. And at 900 meters, at the edge of where the Alder gives up and the country goes to bare rock and the last of the ground we have any business on, we found a cairn that had not been there when I photographed the bench 8 days before. It was smaller than the others, about 3 feet, built of the same rounded cobbles. Set on the top of it, weighted down with a flat stone, was a Forest Service ball cap with a seasonal technician tag inside the band. Nobody in that search party said anything for a long moment. Then the team lead, who was from the state and did not know this valley and had been perfectly professional for 19 days, said, quietly, that he did not like this, and asked me whether we were still going up. We did not go up. I made that call. I have had it questioned in 3 separate reviews, and I have given the same answer every time, which is that the terrain above that point is unroped ice and rotten rock in a season with 11 hours of usable light, and that I was not going to trade 4 more people for a recovery. That is the answer in the file. It is also true. The other answer is that I stood there looking at a stack of stones with a boy's cap on top of it, and I understood that I was being told something in the only language that thing had, and the thing it was telling me was that the exchange had been made and it was finished. Pamela's man, born in 1891, had said it took something back. He had also said it would not take the thing you offered. They suspended the search on the 20th of October. The finding was misadventure, presumed fall, undetermined. The family came up in November and I met them at the visitor center, and Martha and I walked them out to the photo point and stood with them in the sleet while they looked at the ice. And I told them the truth as far as I am able to tell it to a mother, which is that their son was one of the best people I have ever worked with, and that he went into that country to move a truck out of the way of a creek so that nobody else would have to. Scott pulled his instruments in November. He gave me a final plot before he flew out. The infrasound events stopped on the 2nd of October and did not resume for the remainder of the deployment. Not reduced, stopped. The last group of pulses in the entire 6-year archive was recorded at 11:31 in the evening on the 1st of October, from a source located approximately 210 meters up the moraine from the trailhead parking lot, 21 minutes after Zachary walked out the door. Deborah quit flying tours the following spring and took a job in the interior. She told me she could not keep going up that valley. I did not ask her whether she had seen anything from the air that she had left out of her statements, and she did not offer. And about 2 years later she sent me a photograph with no message attached, taken at 400 feet over the west lateral moraine, of a bench of ground with 7 stone cairns on it. She had taken it in June, when I know for a certainty that I had walked that bench myself in May and found nothing there but moss and rock. Martha is still at the center. She has 26 years in now. She answers the 9 questions. She tells 600,000 people a year about pioneer plant species and the succession of alder and cottonwood and spruce, and about how far the ice is pulled back, and every one of them takes the same photograph. I moved to interpretation and administration after that season. I am on the deck most days. I am the one you will talk to if you come up here, and I will be pleasant to you, and I will answer your questions, and if you show me a photograph of a large blurry track on a silt bank, I will give you the laminated speech about brown bear tracks and melted claw impressions in 90 seconds, and every word of that speech is accurate, and I will not tell you the rest of it. Here is what I will tell you. The Mendenhall has withdrawn another 200 meters since the autumn I am describing. It will keep going. The projections are not in dispute, and by the time a child born this year is my age, the face will have pulled back into the upper valley, and there will be open ground where I am standing right now. That ice was a wall for a very long time. There is country behind it that has never had a person in it, and there is something living up there that builds with stone and twists green alder above the height of a man and speaks in a register we were never equipped to hear, and it has been coming down into this valley for as long as anyone here has kept records. And it comes down farther every year, because every year the wall gets shorter. We did not find it. We did not prove it. There is nothing in any file with my name on it that says any of what I have just said to you. There is only this. Sometimes in the spring, when the meltwater comes up under the terminus and runs out across the outwash plain, the ice gives something back. A lantern, a camera, a rope. I check that plain every year in the first week of May. I have checked it every year since. I am still looking for a boot. If this one stayed with you, leave a like on it, and put a comment below telling me whether you would still walk the West Glacier Trail after hearing it, because I read every single one. Subscribe if you want the next account, and there is always a next account, because I kept the log for 9 seasons, and I have not gotten to the worst of it yet. Watch the tree line. Ibn. There is a crate in the back of the maintenance shed at Bartlett Cove that has not been opened in front of a visitor since the summer of 1988. It sits behind 4 spare outboard motors, under a tarp that used to be blue and is now the color of old bone. Every ranger who works a full season here learns about that crate eventually. Nobody shows it to you. You find it, or somebody who is about to retire mentions it once, quietly, while you are both doing something else with your hands. I found it my 2nd season, looking for a fuel filter. Inside the crate there are 11 plaster casts. They are wrapped in newspaper from Juneau, and the newspaper has gone soft and yellow and smells like a basement. Each cast has a strip of masking tape on the back with a date and a location written in pencil. Adams Inlet, Wachusett, Hugh Miller, Rendu. The oldest is dated June of 1966. The newest one, the one that made me sit down on an upturned bucket and stay sitting for a while, is dated the previous September. It had been placed in that crate 5 months before I ever touched it. The casts are of footprints, They are not bear. I have cast bear, I have cast wolf and moose and the strange splayed mess a mountain goat leaves in wet silt. These are none of those. They are 17 inches long at the shortest and 21 at the longest, and the toes are wrong. Not wrong like a deformity. Wrong like a design you have never been shown. I am a ranger at Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve. That is the part of this account that most people find ordinary, so I will get it out of the way early. I run patrols out of Bartlett Cove. I check backcountry permits. I pull kayakers off beaches when the weather turns, and I write incident reports that get filed and never read. 11 seasons now. I know the tide tables in this bay better than I know my own family. I can tell you what the water is doing in Muir Inlet at 4 in the morning on any day you name. What I am going to tell you happened over 9 days in July, and I have written it down 4 times. The first 3 times I destroyed the pages. This is the 4th. I am leaving this one alone. You need to understand something about Glacier Bay before any of the rest of it will land properly. This place is new. That is not a figure of speech. 250 years ago, the entire bay was under ice. A single glacier more than 4,000 feet thick filling the whole valley from the mountains to the sea. When the ice pulled back, and it pulled back faster than ice anywhere else on the continent has ever been recorded pulling back, it left behind 65 miles of open water and raw rock, land that has never held a forest, land that has never held a road, or a trail, or a grave. The lower bay has had 2 centuries to grow. Spruce and hemlock, thick moss, devil's club that will put 50 needles in your palm if you grab it wrong. But go north, up past the Beardsley Islands, up past Tidal Inlet, and the trees thin out and the alder takes over. And then even the alder gives up and you are looking at gray rock and gray silt and a wall of ice at the end of the water. Up there the ground is still arriving. It is still being handed over. Peterson used to say that the land up north had not been assigned yet. That is the word he used, assigned. He would say it and then look at you to see if you understood, and then he would change the subject to outboard maintenance. Peterson was 64 that summer, and had been working this bay in one capacity or another since he was 19 years old. Contract boat crew, then seasonal, then permanent, then something in between that nobody had a title for. He had a face like weathered cedar and a habit of going quiet in the middle of a sentence and never picking the sentence back up. He was the one who made the newest cast in that crate. His handwriting is on the tape. The season started ordinary. It always does. Nicole Martin ran dispatch out of the visitor information station, 58 years old, 23 seasons in the same chair, and she had a voice on the radio that could talk a panicking kayaker down out of a full breakdown in about 90 seconds. She kept a bowl of hard candy on the desk and a list of every vessel in the bay in her head, updated continuously, more reliable than the log. If Nicole said there were 9 parties in the backcountry, there were 9, and she could tell you where all of them were sleeping. Daniel Taylor, 50, ran the maintenance and trail crew. Big hands, permanent squint, a genuine and specific hatred of the composting toilets at the campground. He had spent 11 years fixing everything in the park that could be fixed with a wrench, and he had a policy of not talking about anything he could not fix. Rachel Moore was 35, and the newest permanent among us, a wildlife technician working a multi-year study on how the shoreline animals were moving into the newly uncovered ground in the upper bay. She had recorders on 8 beaches, motion cameras on 4, and a spreadsheet that she loved in a way that was slightly unsettling. She was the most careful person I have ever worked with. That matters later. Christopher Anderson, 44, ran the patrol vessel. 22 years on the water in southeast Alaska, a former commercial captain who had gotten tired of fish and taken government pay instead. He did not spook. I want that on the record before anything else. In 7 years of running with Christopher Anderson, I had seen him take that boat into weather that made me pray, and his heart rate never changed. He would eat a sandwich in 6-foot seas. Matthew Jackson, 42, was not park service. He guided kayak trips for one of the concession outfits out of Gustavus, and he had been doing it long enough that we treated him like staff. He knew the beaches. He briefed his clients properly. He called in when he was supposed to call in. There are guides in this bay who make my life difficult, and Matthew Jackson was never one of them. And there was Lauren Thomas, 61, who had retired 4 years earlier after running the backcountry program for 2 decades, and who came back every July to do a 2-week volunteer stint that everyone pretended was about the interpretive program. It was not about the interpretive program. She came back every July for a reason, and I did not learn the reason until the 6th day of the 9. That is the group. 7 of us, if you count Matthew, and I do. The first thing happened on a Tuesday, and it arrived the way almost everything arrives here, as a radio call that sounded like nothing. Nicole called it up to me at 2:40 in the afternoon. A party of 4 in Adams Inlet, permitted for 6 nights, had used their satellite messenger to send a non-emergency text. The text said, and I am quoting the log because I still have the log, "Animal throwing rocks at camp last night, not a bear, please advise." That kind of message comes in 3 or 4 times a season. People hear a hemlock cone drop on a tent fly at 2 in the morning, and they build a whole story around it before sunrise. Standard practice is to send back a note about bear protocol, food storage, and beach selection, and to check the party on the next scheduled patrol. I sent the standard note. Then I read the message again, and I did not like the phrase, "not a bear." People who are guessing do not write in the negative. People who are guessing think it was a bear. Writing "not a bear" means you have already run through your list and crossed something off, and that is a different mental state entirely. Adams Inlet was on the patrol schedule for Thursday. I moved it to Wednesday. Christopher had the vessel warmed up at 6 in the morning. Rachel came because she had 3 recorders in Adams Inlet that needed cards pulled anyway, and because she had heard the word rocks and gotten a look on her face. The run up the bay took us most of the morning. It is a long way. Bartlett Cove sits at the bottom of a bay that is 65 miles deep, and the upper inlets are a full working day away in anything but perfect water. We went north past the Beardsleys, past Sturgis Island, past the point where the last real forest gives up. The transition never stops getting to me. You watch 200 years of growth run backward outside the window in the space of 2 hours. Big spruce becomes small spruce. Small spruce becomes alder. Alder becomes willow and dryas, and then a long gray nothing, where the ice sat until recently enough that the rock still has scratch marks on it, long parallel grooves cut by stones dragged under a mile of moving ice. Adams Inlet is a shallow arm off the east side of Muir Inlet, and it is one of the strangest pieces of country in the park. It floods and drains enormously with the tide, and at low water there are mudflats and silt beds that go out 400 yards. It is closed to camping in certain sections for bear management. The party of 4 was on an open beach on the north shore, exactly where their permit said they would be, and they were all standing up watching us come in, which is not what happy campers do. Happy campers stay sitting. Their names are in the report, and they are not important to what follows. 4 adults from Washington State, experienced, well-equipped, competent. The leader walked us up the beach without much preamble and showed us the rocks. There were 9 of them, spread in a rough arc on the beach in front of where the tents had been pitched. They were not beach cobbles. Beach cobbles here are rounded and wet and gray. These were angular, dry, and had lichen on one face, which meant they had come off the slope above and behind the camp, from something like 200 feet up and 150 yards back. The largest one was the size of a bowling ball. I could pick it up with 2 hands, and I would not have wanted to throw it any distance at all. The leader said they had come in one at a time over about 40 minutes, starting a little after 1 in the morning. He said there were long gaps between them. He said the last 3 came in from a different angle than the first 6. Rachel was already walking the arc, photographing each stone with a scale card, and she said the thing that changed the shape of the day. She said the spread pattern was too consistent for a slope failure. Rockfall arrives in a burst and it arrives in a line. This arrived in a spread, over time, from at least 2 positions. Something had moved between throws. I asked the group whether they had heard anything else. 3 of them said no. The 4th, a woman in her 50s who had not spoken yet, said she had heard something knock twice on wood. There is no standing wood in that part of Adams Inlet. Nothing that would make that sound. I looked at the slope behind the camp, and there was alder up there, and alder does not knock. Alder is soft and green and it thumps. We walked the slope. It took 2 hours. 200 yards back and up from the beach, in a shallow bowl where meltwater had left a bed of fine gray silt the consistency of wet cement, we found the trackway. I want to describe this carefully, because it is the part of my own account that I have the most trouble with, and I have found that being precise is the only way to keep hold of it. There were 14 impressions in a line running roughly northeast. The line was straight, not the drunken meander of a foraging animal, but a straight line, the walk of something that had a destination and was not interested in what was on either side of it. The stride, heel to heel, measured between 51 and 56 inches. A tall man walking hard covers about 30 inches. To make 54 inches you would need to be running, and this was not running. There was no scuff, no toe drag, no spray of silt at the front of the print the way a running animal throws material forward. The impressions were 19.5 inches long and 7.5 inches across the ball. 5 toes. The big toe was proportionally larger than a human big toe, and it was not fully aligned with the others. The depth was the part that stayed with me. In silt that took my boot to about 1/4 inch, these were sunk 1.5 inches, and in 3 of them there was a distinct mid-foot pressure ridge, a raised bar of displaced silt in the middle of the print where the foot had flexed and pushed. Bears do not do that. Casts do not do that, unless something living made them. Rachel photographed all 14 with scale. She cast 3. Christopher stood at the top of the bowl the entire time with his back to us, watching the alder, and he did not say a single word. And Christopher Anderson always says something. On the far side of the bowl where the alder started, 4 saplings had been bent over at a height of about 8 feet, twisted rather than broken, and laid down across each other in a rough triangle. The breaks were not clean. The wood was crushed and twisted, the way green wood goes when you wring it. You cannot do that to standing alder without both hands and a great deal of leverage and a stance well above the ground. I moved the party of 4 out that afternoon. They did not argue. We took them down to Muir Inlet, and Christopher ran them to a pickup point, and on the way back Rachel sat with a plaster cast on her knees, still curing, and looked at it the way you look at a bill you cannot pay. If you are still with me, and if any of this is landing the way it landed on me on that beach, do me the small favor of hitting the like button and telling me in the comments whether you have ever found something in open country that you could not file under any name you knew. Subscribe if you want to hear how the rest of the 9 days went. It gets worse before it gets clearer, and I am not certain it ever gets fully clear. We tied up at Bartlett Cove at 10 that night, in the long silver twilight that passes for night in July up here, and Peterson was standing on the dock with his hands in his pockets. He had not been told we were coming in. He had not been told where we had been. He looked at the crate box in Rachel's arms, the one with the wet casts in it, and he nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming a delivery he had ordered a long time ago. Then he said, "And this is exact. I remember it exact," he said. "North Shore or south?" I said north. He said, "Then it has come across the inlet, and it does not do that unless it is following something." And he walked away up the dock before I could ask him what. Lauren Thomas arrived on the Thursday morning ferry from Juneau, on schedule, with the same canvas duffel she had carried for 20 years, and a look on her face that told me Peterson had already called her. She was 61, small, and built out of some material that does not tire. She had run the backcountry program here for 22 years and retired at 57 with a party in the visitor center and a plaque that she left in her office drawer. Every July she came back for 2 weeks. Every July she signed on as a volunteer and did interpretive walks at Bartlett Cove that were, honestly, the best walks anybody gave in the park. And every July she asked one specific question of whoever was running patrols, and I had heard her ask it 3 times without ever once understanding what she was asking. The question was, "Has anything moved north this year?" I had always assumed she meant the wildlife study. Moose colonizing the upper bay, wolves working up the east arm, that kind of thing. I would tell her about the moose and she would say that is good and change the subject. That Thursday she did not ask about moose. She came into the ranger station, put her duffel down, looked at me and said, "Adams Inlet?" I said yes. She said, "North Shore." I said yes. She sat down and put both hands flat on the table and was quiet for a good 10 seconds. Then she told me about 1988. In August of that year, Lauren Thomas was 33 years old and a seasonal backcountry ranger, and she was one of 4 people involved in the search for a man named Hollis Vane, who had come into the park with a legal preserve hunting permit for the western side and had, according to the last radio contact, moved east across the divide into an area he had no business being in. Vane was 51, experienced, self-reliant, and had told the outfitter who dropped him that he intended to be out in 11 days. He was not out in 11 days. The search ran 19 days. It covered Wachusett Inlet, Rendu, Hugh Miller, and the whole east side of Muir. They found his camp on the 14th day, 7 miles from where he should have been, and it was intact. Tent standing, sleeping bag inside, unzipped, the way you leave it when you expect to come back. Food bagged and hung correctly. His rifle was in the tent, not with him, in the tent. They found one boot 90 yards away, up the slope, in the crotch of a willow at a height of 11 feet. They never found Hollis Vane. Lauren said that on the 17th day of that search, she and a man named Peterson, who was 26 that summer and running the skiff, camped at the head of Wachusett Inlet and spent the entire night awake while something walked the perimeter of their camp. She said it did not approach. She said it did not vocalize in any way she could describe as an animal call. She said it walked, and stopped, and stood, and walked again, for 6 hours, and that twice it struck wood against wood, 2 strikes, and that both times there was an answer from the opposite side of the inlet. 2 of them. She was very clear about that. In the report she filed, she wrote, "Unidentified large mammal, possible bear," and she said that sentence sat in her chest like a stone for 33 years. The next morning they cast 4 prints in the silt at the tide line. Those are 4 of the 11 in the crate. I asked her the obvious question. I asked why the park had never done anything with it. She gave me an answer that I have thought about more than almost anything else anyone has ever said to me. She said, "Because there is nothing to do with it." She said, "We are not in the business of proving things. We are in the business of keeping people alive on a shoreline." And she said, "The moment that word gets attached to this bay in public, we get 400 people a summer coming up the east arm with rifles and camera drones looking for it, and every single one of them is a body I have to find in the water." So they cast the prints, and they put them in a crate, and they told the incoming rangers where the crate was, and they let the whole thing exist as a piece of institutional folklore that nobody wrote down. Then she said the part that made Rachel put her pen down. She said, "It moves with the ice. Every documented incident, all 11 casts, all the reports that were never really reports, had happened within about 8 miles of the current terminus of a retreating glacier. Not the old ice, the new ground, the country that had been under the glacier within living memory and had just been uncovered. 1966, near the Muir terminus. 1974, Wachusett, right where the ice had just cleared. 1988, 7 miles from the rig's face. And every one of those locations was, by 1988, quiet. Nothing ever happened twice in the same place. The bay had opened 70 miles of new land in 250 years, and something had been walking north into it the whole time, staying at the edge of what had just been revealed, moving as the ice moved. Rachel said the thing that a careful person says. She said, or the reports follow the rangers, and the rangers follow the ice, because the ice is where the work is. Lauren said, "That is a fair objection, and I have made it to myself every July for 33 years. And then she said, "And it is wrong, and I cannot tell you how I know." That afternoon, Matthew Jackson called in from Wachusett Inlet with a party of 6 and reported that one of his clients had walked away from camp at some point before dawn and had not come back. Wachusett Inlet is about 7 miles from the current face of the Burroughs ice. I want you to hold that number. The call came at 11:20 in the morning. Nicole took it, and she did the thing she always did, which was to get every single piece of information in under 2 minutes without ever sounding hurried. Missing person, male, 31, from Colorado. Name on the permit and in the report. Not relevant to what I am telling you. Last seen at approximately 11 the previous night. sitting on a log at the edge of camp. Tent found unoccupied at 6:30. Boots gone. Rain jacket gone. Headlamp gone. Sleeping bag unzipped and left open. Sleeping bag unzipped and left open. I heard Lauren make a small sound across the room. We launched inside of 40 minutes. Christopher had the vessel. Rachel came. Daniel Taylor came because when there is a search in this park, Daniel Taylor comes. And Lauren came because when I told her to stay at Bartlett Cove, she looked at me the way a schoolteacher looks at a student who has said something beneath him. Peterson took his own boat and left 20 minutes before us and beat us there by an hour, which should not have been possible, and I have never asked how. Wachusett Inlet runs west off Muir Inlet, 6 miles long, steep-sided, with a broad silt delta at the head where meltwater comes down off the ice. It is a wide-open country up there, very little cover, the kind of place where you can look at 4 square miles at once and feel confident you would see a moving person. We did not see a moving person. Matthew Jackson met us at the beach and he was in bad shape. He had done everything correctly and he knew it, and it was not helping him at all. He had kept the other 5 clients in camp. He had marked the last known position. He had not disturbed the tent. He had walked the beach in both directions to the limits of safe travel and back. He was pale and steady and furious with himself in a way that I recognized because I have been that exact person on 2 occasions. He told me something while we were setting up the search grid that I did not put in the report, and I have regretted that omission for 4 years. He said that on each of the 2 nights before, at somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, the entire camp had been woken by a sound. He described it as a long, low call, dropping in pitch at the end, coming from up the delta, lasting maybe 4 seconds, repeated 3 or 4 times over an hour. He said his clients had asked him what it was, and he had said moose, because he did not have a better answer to give 6 people in tents at 1 in the morning. Moose do not sound like that. Moose in July sound like a large animal breathing and occasionally stepping on things. What Matthew described, when he finally described it properly, was a call with a shape to it, a rise and a fall, something with intent behind it. The missing man had been sitting on a log at the edge of camp at 11 at night, facing up the delta, and then he had gotten up and put his boots on and walked toward it. We ran the search the way you run a search. Grid the delta. Work the tide line both directions. Get the helicopter from Juneau when the ceiling allows, which that day it did not, because the ceiling was 400 feet and dropping. Rachel took the recorders. Daniel took the west shore. Christopher stayed with the boat and worked the water with binoculars, because a person in the water is a person you have about 20 minutes to find in Alaska. I took the delta with Lauren. We found the first sign at 2 in the afternoon, 900 yards up the silt from camp. Boot prints, his, size 11, walking, not running, walking, in a straight line, up the middle of the delta toward the ice. 200 yards further on, the second set of prints joined from the north. I have described these once already, and I am not going to describe them again in detail. I will only tell you the differences. This trackway was longer, 31 impressions, and at 3 points along its length, the stride shortened dramatically, from 54 inches down to about 26, and at those points the prints turned partly sideways, and the depth increased on one edge. It had stopped and turned and stood, 3 times, facing the direction of the man. The 2 sets of tracks ran parallel for about 400 yards, never closer than 60 feet apart, and then they both went up onto the rock and the silt ended, and there was nothing more to read. Lauren stood at the end of the silt for a long moment, and then she said, "It walked him out. It did not take him, it walked him." At 4:10 in the afternoon, Daniel Taylor called on the radio, and his voice was wrong. Daniel Taylor has a radio voice like a man ordering lunch. This was not that. He had found the rain jacket. It was 11 feet up in a willow on the north side of the delta, wedged into a fork, and it was not torn. It had been placed. 11 feet, in a willow. I made Daniel wait for us. On my way to him I passed Peterson, who was standing on a gravel bar in the middle of the delta doing absolutely nothing, just standing, facing up valley toward the ice, and when I got close he said without turning around, "It is still here." I said, "How do you know?" He said, Because the birds have not come back, and it has been 4 hours. I stopped and I listened, and he was right. And once you notice that kind of silence, you cannot stop noticing it. There were no gulls on the delta. There are always gulls on that delta. There were no ravens. In a place with 6 people camped and a dozen people searching and food in bags, there were no ravens. The weather closed at 6. The ceiling came down onto the water, and it began to rain the way it rains in southeast Alaska, which is not weather so much as a change in the medium you are living in. I made the call to hold the search overnight at the Wachusett position rather than pull everybody back to Muir. We had a man out there in the wet with no jacket, and a night is a long time. There is an old patrol cabin at the head of Wachusett, put in during the 70s. 4 bunks, a stove, a tin roof and shutters that latch from the inside. It had not been used in 2 years. Peterson was against it. He said it plainly and only once. He said, "Not that cabin." I overruled him. I had 11 seasons and a badge and a missing man and a storm. And I overruled a man who had 64 years and every reason on earth to be listened to. That is the decision. If you want to know the exact place where this stopped being a search and became the other thing, it was that decision, made at 6:15 in the evening, in the rain, on a gravel beach in Wachusett Inlet. There were 6 of us in that cabin. Myself, Lauren, Rachel, Daniel, Peterson, and Christopher, who had anchored the vessel in the deepest water he could find and come ashore in the skiff because he did not like the look of the anchorage and liked the look of us being split up even less. Matthew Jackson stayed with his 5 clients on the beach a mile and a half down, in their tents, which I will regret for the rest of my working life. But the alternative was moving 5 civilians through open country at night in a storm, and I made the call I made. The cabin sits about 60 yards above the tide line on a bench of gravel, with the delta opening out in front of it, and a slope of loose rock and low willow rising behind. 4 bunks, a table, a plank floor, a wood stove, and a generator in a shed 20 feet off the back wall that runs a single light and a battery charger. The windows have plywood shutters that latch from inside. Whoever built that cabin built it to be shut. We got the stove going and hung wet gear and made a plan for first light. Rachel set 2 recorders, one on the porch rail and one at the corner of the generator shed. Lauren did not take off her boots. I noticed that, and I did not say anything. The generator went off at 10 past midnight. It did not sputter. It did not run out of fuel. It stopped between one revolution and the next, the way it stops when the kill switch is thrown, and the light in the cabin went out and left us with the stove glow and the gray non-night of an Alaskan July coming through the one window we had not shuttered. Daniel stood up and reached for his jacket, and Peterson said, "Sit down," in a voice I had never heard him use. Daniel sat down. We waited 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because Rachel was watching the recorder timestamp and she told me afterward. The first knock came from behind the cabin, up the slope, and it was not a small sound. It was the sound of a heavy piece of wood swung against a standing trunk, and there is not much standing timber at the head of Wachusett Inlet, which meant it had brought the wood with it, or it had found the one dead spruce trunk on the whole bench, and I do not know which of those 2 possibilities I like less. 2 strikes. A pause of about 8 seconds. 2 more. Then, from across the delta, from a very long way off, 2 strikes came back. I have listened to Rachel's recording of that exchange perhaps 40 times. The second set is real. It is not an echo. The interval is wrong for an echo. The amplitude envelope is wrong, and the strike separation is different. Something on the north side answered something on the south side, across roughly 2 miles of open silt, in a storm. Christopher Anderson, who does not spook, stood up and quietly, and without being asked, put the bar across the door. For the next 4 hours, something walked around that cabin. I want to be very precise about what that was like, because in every account of this kind of thing that I have ever heard, the teller reaches for words like terror and evil, and I do not think those words are accurate, and I have had 4 years to look for better ones. It was not frightening the way a bear is frightening. A bear at your camp is a problem with a shape. You know its intentions, its capabilities, and its options. You can act. This was frightening in the way that being watched by something patient is frightening. It never rushed the cabin. It never struck the walls. It walked, slowly, on two legs, on gravel, and gravel is the most honest surface in the world. You cannot fake a footfall on gravel. Each step was a distinct compression, and the interval between steps was long, and the weight behind each one made the empty cups on the table move. It circled. It would go quiet for 15 or 20 minutes, and I would begin to believe it had gone. And then a single step would come from a completely different side of the cabin, with no approach, which meant it had crossed that ground silently, and had chosen to let us hear that one step. At about 2 in the morning it stood at the north wall for a period that Rachel timed at 19 minutes. Nothing, no movement, just the knowledge, absolutely certain in all six of us, of a mass standing on the other side of 3/4 of an inch of plywood siding. There is no rational way to know that. We all knew it. Every one of us was looking at the same section of wall. Daniel Taylor started to cry at some point in there, quietly, and nobody looked at him. And he was not ashamed afterward, and none of us ever mentioned it. He is a good man, and he had been up since 4 in the morning looking for somebody's son. At 2:30, something dragged across the roof. It started at the low eave on the north side and moved across the tin toward the ridge, and the sound was not claws. Claws on tin are a sharp multiple scrape, and every one of us has heard a marten or a squirrel do it. This was a single broad heavy contact, dragging, about the width of a forearm, moving slowly from the eave to the peak and stopping. The roof took it. The whole cabin flexed and settled, and the roof took it. Then, from directly above us, there came a sound that I have never been able to categorize, and that Rachel's recorder caught at a level that clips in 3 places. It was low. It came in under the storm, which is a thing that almost nothing does. It started as something like a long exhalation, developed a pitch, rose, and then dropped off at the end into a register that I felt in the bench under me before I heard it in my ears. Lauren Thomas said, out loud, in a completely level voice, 33 years. At about 4, Peterson stood up and picked up the axe from beside the stove and set it down again, and then he went to the shuttered window on the east side and unlatched it. Christopher said his name. Peterson said, "I want it to know we know." He opened the shutter about 4 inches. I was standing directly behind him, and I saw what he saw, and I have had 4 years to talk myself out of it, and I have not managed it. 40 feet from the cabin, at the top of the gravel bench where the willow starts, there was a standing shape. The gray non-light of the northern night was behind it, and the rain was between us and it, and I am not going to claim I saw detail because I did not. I saw outline, and I saw 2 things about that outline. The first is that it was too tall, and the proportion was wrong. The arms came down too far. The shoulders were too wide relative to the hips, and the head sat forward on the shoulders with very little neck. It was not a man in the rain. I have seen men in the rain at 40 feet at 4 in the morning, and I have seen this, and they are not the same silhouette. The second is that when Peterson opened that shutter, it turned its head. Not its body, its head. It turned and looked at 4 inches of open window from 40 feet away in the rain, and it had been standing there in complete stillness for who knows how long, doing exactly what we were doing, which was waiting to see what the other one would do. Then it stepped backward, once, into the willow, and it was gone. Not running, backward. It did not turn its back on the cabin. Pedersen latched the shutter and sat down at the table and put his hands flat on the wood and said nothing for about a minute. Then he said, "That is the 4th time." Nobody asked him about the other 3. If you are the kind of person who reads that and immediately begins looking for the explanation, and I want you to know that I respect that instinct and I have spent 4 years being that person myself, then leave a comment and give me the explanation. I mean that sincerely. I have a recording, 6 witnesses, and a set of casts, and no answer at all. And if you want the last part of this, the part 1 have never told anyone in the service, subscribe and stay with me, because the 9th day is the reason I wrote any of this down. The generator, when Daniel checked it at 6 in the morning, was undamaged, full tank. It started on the 2nd pull. The kill switch had been pressed. We found him on the 9th day, and he was alive. 2 miles up the delta from the cabin, in the direction of the ice, sitting on a boulder with his boots on and his headlamp still around his neck with the battery dead. He was hypothermic, dehydrated, and had lost about 11 pounds. He had been out for 4 nights in weather that should have killed him twice over, without a jacket, and he was alive. The helicopter took him to Juneau. He recovered fully. He has never spoken publicly about any of it, and I want to be clear that this is his right, and I am not going to spend it for him. He said 3 things to me in the 20 minutes I sat with him on that boulder waiting for the helicopter, and I am going to give you all 3 exactly as he said them, and then I am going to stop. He said, I could not tell if it wanted me to follow it or to leave. He said, it kept putting things where I would find them. And he said, at the end, when I sat down and stopped, it sat down too. We closed the file in September. The official finding was that a visitor became disoriented at night, walked away from camp and survived 4 days of exposure due to mild conditions and a sheltered position. Every word of that is technically true. It is the most honest lie I have ever helped to write. The rain jacket in the willow appears in the report as recovered from vegetation. The trackway in the delta appears as animal sign, undetermined species, photographed. The 19 minutes at the north wall does not appear at all. There is no field on the form for that. Rachel Moore submitted her audio recordings to the regional office through the proper channel, correctly documented, with the timestamps and the equipment specifications and every piece of methodology she had. She received an acknowledgement of receipt. That is all she has ever received. She still works here. She still runs the shoreline study. She has added, without telling anyone, a set of 4 recorders in the Upper East Arm that are not part of any funded project, and every spring she moves them a little further north, tracking the ice. Lauren Thomas came back the following July, and the July after, and the one after that. She does not ask the question anymore. She does not need to. She just finds me in the first week and I tell her where, and she nods. Daniel Taylor put in for a transfer that winter, and then withdrew it in February and never mentioned it again. He fixed the generator shed. He put a heavier hasp on the cabin door and a second bar bracket on the inside, and he did that work on his own time, and nobody signed off on it, and nobody asked him to. Matthew Jackson still guides. He does not take parties to the head of Wachusett anymore. He tells his clients the beach has bad holding ground, which is a reasonable thing to say and completely untrue. Christopher Anderson has never spoken about that night, to me or to anyone, except once. 2 seasons later, coming down from Tar Inlet in flat water with nothing to do for 4 hours, he said, without any preamble at all, I have been on this water 24 years and there is not a thing in this bay I cannot name except that. And then he ate a sandwich and we did not discuss it further. Pedersen retired the following spring. He came into the maintenance shed on his last day, and I was in there, and neither of us mentioned that this was obviously deliberate. He pulled the tarp off the crate, took out one of the casts I had made in Wachusett, wrote a date and a location on a strip of masking tape, and put it back in with the other 11. 12 now, he said. You are the one who knows where this is. I said I understood. He said, it is not a monster, and it is not a legend, and I want you to stop trying to make it be either of those, because that is what makes people go looking for it, he said. It is an animal that lives at the edge of ground that has just been uncovered, and there is very little of that kind of ground left anywhere in the world, and this bay is making more of it every single year, he said. We are opening the door for it. 70 miles in 250 years. That is faster than anything alive can move. That is not it coming to us. That is us pulling the ice back off it. Then he shook my hand and left, and I have not seen him since. And I understand he lives in Sitka now and does not go out on the water. I am still here. 15 seasons now. I check permits, and I run the East Arm, and I write reports. And every spring, in the first week, I take the survey chart of the bay, and I look at where the terminus lines have moved since the year before, and I mark the new water and the new beach, and I have started keeping a second chart that nobody else sees, where I put a small dot on every location that has ever produced a cast, or a report, or a night that somebody could not explain. The dots make a line. The line runs north. It has been running north for as long as anyone has been writing anything down in this bay, and it runs at almost exactly the same rate as the ice. There is about 11 more miles of ice at the head of the west arm. I will be retired before it is gone. Somebody else will be sitting in this chair, and there will be a crate in the back of the maintenance shed with more than 12 casts in it, and one day a new ranger looking for a fuel filter is going to pull that tarp off and sit down on a bucket and stay sitting for a while. If that is you, reading this in a folder that is not supposed to exist, then here is everything I know that is worth passing on. Do not go looking for it. It will find you if the ground is new enough and you are quiet enough and you stay out past the point where the birds go silent. Do not open the shutter. And when you write your report, write it exactly the way Lauren Thomas taught me to write it. Technically true and completely useless, because our job is not to prove anything. Our job is to keep people alive on a shoreline that is getting longer every year. Thank you for staying with me all the way through this. If it held you, hit the like button and tell me in the comments what you would have done when Peterson reached for that shutter latch. Because I have never decided whether he was brave or whether he was simply finishing a conversation he had started 33 years earlier. Subscribe if you want more accounts from the country where the ice is pulling back. Something is walking north into new ground, and the ice is still moving. The weight of preparation had been heavy on my shoulders for weeks before we departed. 6 of us had committed to this expedition into Alaska's remote interior, and I found myself as the de facto leader, though leadership in such situations felt more like responsibility for potential catastrophe than anything resembling authority. We arrived in Bethel on a Tuesday evening, when the summer light refused to surrender to darkness. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting everything in shades of amber and copper. The small airport felt smaller than I expected, and stepping onto the tarmac, I could taste the cold bite of northern air, despite the calendar insisting it was July. Natalie Ramirez was the first to join me at the rental office. She had this habit of moving with deliberate purpose, each step calculated. At 35, she possessed the lean build of someone accustomed to physical exertion, though her eyes held something I couldn't quite place, something that suggested she knew more than she was saying about why she wanted this expedition. The locals seemed strange when I asked about supplies, she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. At the general store. The way they looked at us, not hostile exactly, more like warning. I dismissed it as the natural weariness of small communities toward outsiders. That was before I understood what lived in those forests. Douglas James arrived with the camping equipment, his truck laden with tents, portable stoves, and navigation gear. At 54, he moved like a man accustomed to wilderness. His weathered face suggested decades spent under open skies, and his hands bore the calluses of genuine labor. But there was something else about Douglas, a tension that seemed to increase the moment the sun began its descent toward the horizon. "We need to be back in town before full dark," he said, not as a suggestion but as a requirement. "Every night, no exceptions. I don't care what the plan says." Carol Watson joined us that evening, her presence commanding despite her relatively quiet demeanor. She was 50, with the bearing of someone who had spent her life making decisions that affected others. She'd organized this expedition with meticulous attention to detail, and I'd assumed that meant she knew exactly what we were doing. I was wrong. "There's a hunting cabin about 20 kilometers northeast," Carol explained, spreading a map across the table in our motel room. "Belongs to a former client of mine. It's equipped, relatively secure, and it provides a good base for exploring the region." Benjamin Brooks, our group's youngest member at 42, studied the map with the intensity of a man who believed he could read stories in topography. He'd described himself as a nature documentarian, which I interpreted as someone who took excellent photographs and had convinced people to pay for his travels. But his knowledge of animal behavior proved invaluable, and his camera equipment was genuinely impressive. "What's this area?" Benjamin pointed to a section of the map marked with hand-drawn circles and what appeared to be warning symbols in faded pencil. No one answered immediately. Judith Kelly, the oldest among us at 68, had been the first to book this expedition. She'd paid the deposit before most of us had even committed to dates. She claimed she was a nature enthusiast conducting personal research, but I'd discovered through subtle questioning that she was actually writing about indigenous folklore and the way such stories persisted in remote communities. Old maps, Judith said finally, studying the marks, from when trappers and hunters tried to catalog the region, before most record-keeping became formalized. But that wasn't quite the truth either, as I would later understand. Charles Sanders completed our party. At 57, he was an enigma wrapped in the affectation of a wealthy businessman who decided to reconnect with nature. He spent significant money on equipment and casually mentioned properties he owned in various states. Yet he treated the wilderness with the reverence of someone who genuinely feared it. That first night in Bethel, we gathered in the motel's small dining area. The local cook, a woman who introduced herself as Margaret, prepared salmon with surprising skill. But when I mentioned our plans to explore the region, her hands stilled for just a moment. "You should hire a guide," she said. "Someone who knows the land and knows what to avoid." "We have navigation equipment," I replied, "and we're experienced." Margaret said nothing more, but as she cleared our plates, I caught her exchanging a glance with Douglas, a look that suggested communication had occurred between them before we even arrived. That night, I couldn't sleep. The midnight sun cast my motel room in perpetual twilight, and my mind circled endlessly around small details that seemed wrong without my ability to articulate exactly why. The warning in Margaret's voice, the tension in Douglas's jaw, the marks on Judith's map that looked almost like fence posts or boundaries drawn by someone desperate to define dangerous territory. Around 3 in the morning, I heard Douglas in the hallway outside my room. His voice was low, urgent, speaking into his phone. "They don't understand. These people have never dealt with it. One summer night, they think they know what nightfall means in the north. They have no fucking idea." The line went dead. I lay in the darkness, watching the amber light at the edges of the curtains, and felt the first genuine stirring of dread. We departed for the cabin at dawn. The drive was beautiful in a way that seemed almost mocking. Towering evergreens, rushing water that reflected the sky like liquid silver, wildlife that scattered at our approach. Carol drove while I sat passenger, watching the landscape transform from managed settlements to genuine wilderness. "Have you ever heard of skinwalkers?" Carol asked suddenly, her eyes fixed on the road. "Native American folklore," I said. "Navajo, primarily. Beings that can take animal forms, consumed with malevolence." "That's the simplified version," Carol said. "The version that gets published in books and shared around campfires by people who don't actually know anything. The reality is far more complicated and far more dangerous." "Why are you telling me this?" Carol's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. "Because I've been to the interior of Alaska before, to places most people avoid, and I've learned that stories, real stories, the kind that indigenous peoples have refined over thousands of years, exist for reasons, usually because something in those stories is true." The cabin emerged from the forest like a structure that had decided to exist only partially in our reality. It was well maintained, equipped with propane heating and a large water tank, and positioned on a ridge that allowed views across miles of forest in every direction. Carol had not exaggerated its security. The doors were reinforced, the windows had substantial locks, and the interior had been designed with survival as the primary concern. "Who owned this place?" Benjamin asked, walking the perimeter with his camera. "A man named Harlan Cross," Carol said. "He spent 40 years studying animal migration patterns and the relationship between predator populations and human settlements. He died 5 years ago. Left the cabin to a preservation society, but it's rarely used." "Why did he die?" Judith asked. Carol was quiet for a long moment. "He went outside during the night," she said finally. "During the season when the sun barely sets. He told his daughter he needed to observe something. The next morning, they found his body a kilometer from the cabin. The official report said he was attacked by bears, but the wounds, they weren't consistent with any known animal." That evening, as the sun continued its shallow arc across the horizon, we sat on the cabin's porch and watched the forest. The birds had gone quiet, the normal sounds of wilderness, wind through branches, distant water, the subtle movements of life, had faded to an almost complete absence. "We should establish a watch rotation," Douglas said. "2 people awake at all times after midnight, someone monitoring the perimeter." "This is supposed to be a relaxation trip," Charles complained, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is a trip into a region where things live that most people in the world have never encountered," Douglas countered. "Things that don't follow normal rules. Humor me." I assigned myself the first watch along with Natalie. The others dispersed to prepare bedding and supplies. As darkness crept across the sky with impossible slowness, Natalie and I sat with our backs to the cabin wall, facing the tree line. "I know things," Natalie said quietly. "Things that I haven't told the others. Things I've only told Carol." "What kind of things?" "My brother disappeared in this region 8 years ago. He was hunting. He was supposed to be back by evening. They found his camp 3 days later, completely intact. No signs of struggle, just an empty tent and equipment left behind, as if he'd simply stepped into the trees and stopped existing." My stomach tightened. "Did they search for him?" "For weeks. Brought in trackers, search teams, everything. It was like he'd been erased from the landscape. And the locals, the Yupik people who live here, they weren't surprised. They told my family that he'd done something, made some kind of mistake. They wouldn't specify what." "Do you think he was killed by an animal? A bear? A predator of some kind?" Natalie turned to look at me. In the amber twilight, her eyes seemed impossibly old. "I think something decided to wear his skin, and when it was finished, there was nothing left of him to find. Around 4 in the morning, when the night had become its palest, we heard the howl. It wasn't the sound any of us expected. It possessed a quality that seemed wrong. Not quite wolf, not quite canine in any conventional sense. It contained harmonics that shouldn't exist in animal vocalizations. A complexity that suggested something mimicking the shape of a wolf's voice, while adding dimensions that belonged to something entirely other." Douglas appeared immediately at the cabin door, rifle in hand. "Inside," he commanded. "Now, lock everything, window shutters closed." We didn't argue. The sound had generated a response in our nervous systems that bypassed rational thought. Pure dread, pure animal understanding that something was fundamentally wrong. Inside, with the shutters fastened and every door secured, we gathered in the central room. The rifle in Douglas's hands seemed impossibly small against the weight of the darkness pressing against the cabin's walls. "What was that?" Charles whispered. "Something that wants us to know it's aware of us," Judith said. She was calm, almost meditative. "Something that's decided to announce itself." "Why would it do that?" I asked. "Because," Judith said, "we entered its territory, and it wants us to understand exactly what the rules are." The sound came again as dawn finally broke with genuine darkness lifting from the land. This time it was closer, echoing from what seemed to be the forest directly east of the cabin. Douglas stood at the window, a pair of binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the tree line with the intensity of a man looking for something he desperately hoped not to find. "It's still there," he said quietly. 300 meters out, moving along the ridge. "What is it?" Benjamin demanded, his camera forgotten, his usual enthusiasm completely absent. "Describe it." "I can't," Douglas said, "because what I'm seeing doesn't align with anything in my experience. The body structure is wrong. The way it moves is wrong. It looks like a wolf, except the proportions are all distorted. Too tall, too angular." Natalie had positioned herself as far from the window as possible, pressed into a corner of the main room. Carol stood near the kitchen area, methodically checking supplies and making notes on a pad of paper. She moved like someone executing a plan she'd mentally rehearsed many times. "We need to stay inside," Carol said. "All day, regardless of how bright it gets. Skinwalkers are more vulnerable during full daylight, but they don't stop existing. They simply operate under constraints. They have limitations we need to understand." "Skinwalker," Charles repeated, the word foreign in his mouth. "You're actually suggesting that thing outside is a skinwalker, that we're dealing with folklore made manifest." "Folklore," Judith said, "is usually just poorly understood documentation of reality. People observed these things for thousands of years. They developed specific protocols for dealing with them. Those protocols exist in the surviving stories. What protocols? I asked. Don't leave the group, Judith began, counting on her fingers. Don't acknowledge it directly. Looking it in the eyes is dangerous. Don't attempt to convince it of anything. They don't operate on human logic. Most importantly, don't shed your own skin, metaphorically or literally. They're drawn to spiritual vulnerability and physical wounds. That's insane, Charles said flatly. It's also all we have, Carol replied. The day stretched on with agonizing slowness. The cabin felt increasingly like a trap. Four walls that provided the illusion of security while something utterly incomprehensible circled the perimeter. Benjamin attempted to photograph it several times, moving to different windows and adjusting his zoom lens. But each time he tried to capture an image, the thing seemed to sense his attention and withdrew into the deeper forest. Around what we were calling afternoon, though the sun made traditional time almost meaningless, Douglas noticed something that shifted our understanding of the situation. There were now two of them. The second one came from the north, he reported, his voice carrying a vibration of barely controlled fear. It's larger than the first. The movements are more deliberate. There could be a pack, Benjamin said. A family unit. They hunt together. These things don't hunt like normal predators, Carol said. They hunt according to logic we don't have a framework for understanding. They may be hunting us. They may be studying us. They may be doing something else entirely that we lack the cognitive capacity to recognize. Judith had begun writing furiously in a journal she'd brought, documenting everything, the times Douglas reported seeing them, their positions, their movements. She wrote with the dedication of someone compiling evidence for posterity, or perhaps for someone coming after us who might need this information to survive. My brother's journal was found with his tent, Natalie said suddenly. She'd been silent for hours, and her voice came out hoarse from disuse. I never mentioned this. My family kept it quiet. In the final entry, he wrote that he could see it watching him from the tree line. He described its eyes as containing an intelligence that felt contemptuous. He wrote that it was waiting for something, that it was evaluating the texture of my fear. How did he conclude? Carol asked gently. He wrote, I'm going to go outside now. I don't think it wants me to stay inside. I think the tent feels like an insult to it. The implication hung in the air between us like poison gas. Evening approached with the slow, deliberate pace of something alive and waiting. The light took on a quality that seemed almost malevolent, not quite twilight, not quite noon, but something that existed in the spectrum between. Douglas kept the rifle loaded and positioned near the main door. I noticed he'd chambered a round, though I doubted anyone had actually discussed whether shooting one of these things was even possible. It was Charles who heard the scratching first. It came from the roof, a deliberate, methodical sound, like something with claws attempting to find purchase on the metal panels. But more disturbing than the sound itself was its deliberateness. It wasn't the random scratching of an animal looking for entry. It was calculated, probing, testing. It's trying to find a way in, Benjamin whispered. No, Judith said. It's trying to get us to think about leaving. It's creating pressure, psychological stress. It wants us to panic and make mistakes. The scratching continued for nearly an hour. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed seemed worse than the sound had been. We sat in that silence, listening to our own breathing, trying to convince ourselves that what we'd experienced had been real. Around what we calculated to be midnight, Natalie's nose began to bleed. It happened without warning, blood dripping steadily onto her shirt despite her tilting her head back and pinching the bridge of her nose. But as I watched, I realized it wasn't coming from her nostrils. It was coming from somewhere deeper inside her, as if her entire sinus cavity was hemorrhaging. This is a sign, Judith said, moving quickly to help her. This means it's becoming aware of her specifically. It means it's recognizing her connection to what happened to her brother. We need to stop this, I said, looking toward Douglas and the rifle. Whatever that thing is, we need to kill it. With a rifle? Carol's laugh was short, bitter. You can't shoot something that doesn't exist fully in our reality. You can't kill something that doesn't play by our rules. The bullet would pass through it like it's made of smoke. Then what do we do? Charles demanded, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by genuine panic. We endure, Carol said. Until daylight, we maintain the barricades and we endure. But endurance became increasingly difficult as the night progressed. Benjamin began to hear voices. Not auditory hallucinations, he insisted, but actual voices coming from just outside the cabin, mimicking our own conversations. He heard his mother calling him by a childhood nickname only she had ever used. He heard himself speaking, recounting memories that he'd never shared with anyone. It's not hearing, Judith explained. It's mimicking, taking the shape of voices, using sound the way it uses physical form, as a tool for manipulation and infiltration of our psychological space. Charles stopped sleeping. He sat rigid in a chair, staring at nothing, his eyes occasionally twitching toward windows we'd sealed shut. Douglas gave him water, which he drank mechanically, but he never spoke, never made eye contact. It was as if a significant portion of his consciousness had been cordoned off by whatever was outside. I found myself unable to stop thinking about the cabin's previous owner, Harlan Cross. He'd spent 40 years studying predator-prey dynamics, understanding the relationship between hunters and hunted. And then one night, he'd gone outside. Had he gone willingly? Or had something made him understand? The way that Judith's description suggested these things could make humans comprehend things outside normal comprehension, that leaving was necessary, that the act of stepping outside was somehow a survival mechanism. Around 4 a.m, I heard Douglas in the kitchen, speaking quietly into his satellite phone. "I told you I shouldn't come here," he said. "I told you what I learned the last time. These things have memory. They recognize individual humans. I killed one of them in 09. This one outside, it knows me. It's been waiting. It's not here for the others. It's here because I came back." There was a pause. "No, you can't send help. What would help even look like? You can't send the military to fight folklore. You can't shoot an idea. You can't kill something that exists in the spaces between what's real and what's imagined." Another pause. "I'm not leaving them to die. I'm going to find a way to finish this." He disconnected and noticed me standing in the doorway. "What did you do in 2009? I asked. "I went hunting," Douglas said. "Real hunting. Moose primarily, in this region. A skinwalker appeared near my camp. It took the form of a cow moose, but something about it was fundamentally wrong. I shot it 7 times before it finally stopped moving. I thought I'd killed it. I spent 3 years afterward checking if it was actually dead. And it came back. Different form, but the same intelligence behind the eyes. Same contempt. I recognized it because skinwalkers carry traces of their previous form somehow. Scars that transfer between shapes. This one outside. It's the same one. It's been hunting me since I put those bullets in it. So it's not interested in us. Just you. It's interested in whoever is here with me," Douglas said. "That's how they work. They take whatever is present and they use it as leverage. They're interested in maximum suffering. They're interested in turning alliances into betrayals, love into trauma." Morning finally came. Not suddenly, but as a gradual lightening of the sky that felt like waking from a nightmare and discovering the nightmare was now your waking life. The full daylight pushed the creatures back, but they didn't disappear. Douglas continued to track them with his binoculars. "They're moving away," he reported, "heading deeper into the forest. But they're not gone. They're just retreating to cover. We have maybe 8 hours before sunset. We need to use that time to prepare." "Prepare for what?" Charles asked. He'd been silent for so long that hearing his voice was startling. "For the night to come again," Carol said. "For however many nights it takes before we can leave this place." On the second full day at the cabin, we attempted the impossible. We decided to leave. The logic, as Carol explained it, was sound on a rational level. The skinwalkers were more vulnerable in daylight. Their powers limited, their forms less flexible. If we moved quickly, traveled in the open where they would be forced to operate under constraints, we could reach the nearest settlement, a small community about 40 kilometers south, before darkness arrived again. Douglas argued against it with the vehemence of someone who'd survived something most people wouldn't have survived. "Every time you move, you change the dynamic," he said. "These things are hunters. They understand territory. The moment we're in motion, We're vulnerable in ways that being stationary doesn't allow for. But Charles was losing his mind. His silence had evolved into something worse, a kind of catatonic state interrupted by moments of sudden violence. He'd attempted to open the cabin door at 3 in the morning, completely unresponsive to our attempts to restrain him. Benjamin had tackled him, and they'd struggled across the floor while the rest of us watched, uncertain whether to help or leave Charles to whatever compulsion was driving him. Judith believed Charles was being directly influenced. "It's chosen him as a conduit," she said quietly. "It's found something in his psychology, some vulnerability, and it's using him as a direct connection." "Then we absolutely have to leave," Carol insisted. "If one of us is compromised, we need to get to safety before that compromise becomes catastrophic." Douglas finally acquiesced with obvious reluctance. He spent most of the morning preparing our exit, checking maps, calculating distances, gathering supplies that would sustain us during the drive. Benjamin's photographs of the skinwalkers had come out perfectly clear, impossibly detailed, as if the creatures had wanted to be documented. Judith continued her notes with the diligence of someone writing a final testimony. We left at noon, the sun at its highest point, the sky so bright that shadows barely existed. Douglas drove while I sat passenger, constantly turning to watch the forest behind us. Natalie, Judith, and Benjamin occupied the middle row, with Charles in the back, sedated with medication from the cabin's first aid kit that we hoped would keep him unconscious long enough for us to reach safety. The road was barely a road, more of a collection of drive-worn paths that the truck navigated with difficulty. For the first 2 hours, I dared to believe we might actually escape. The forest passed beside us without incident. The sky remained brilliant and clear. Behind us, there was no sign of pursuit. It was Benjamin who noticed the elk first. It stood on the road ahead, massive and impossibly still. Douglas immediately began to slow the truck, but Benjamin made a noise of warning, something between a gasp and a shout. "That's not an elk," he said. "Look at the legs. The proportions are wrong." The creature's form was indeed wrong in ways that were almost impossible to articulate. It had the basic structure of an elk, complete with an impressive rack of antlers, but everything was subtly distorted. The legs were too long, the body too angular. The way it stood suggested muscles and joints that didn't align with anything in natural biology. "Don't stop," Douglas said, accelerating. "Don't engage it. Don't even look directly at it." But as we approached, the creature turned its massive head to watch us, and in its eyes, massive, black, utterly empty of anything resembling animal consciousness, was an intelligence so profound and so deeply hostile that I felt my entire body contract with primal terror. The moment we passed it, the thing moved. Not gracefully, not naturally, but with a mechanical purpose that suggested it was operating according to principles we couldn't perceive. It bounded toward the truck with an ungainly gait that somehow covered impossible distances, and I heard its antlers scrape across the truck's roof with a sound like knives on metal. Douglas accelerated harder, and the truck lurched forward. In the side mirror, I watched the thing continue its pursuit, but it began to fade, to become less substantial, as if the concentrated daylight was somehow causing it to lose cohesion. "It's burning in the sunlight," Judith said from the back seat. "The daylight is actually harming it. That's why they hunt at night." But it was desperate. It risked exposure because it didn't want us to leave. We drove for another 2 hours without incident, and the sun began its final descent. The horizon took on shades of amber and gold, and I felt a growing dread that the entire endeavor had been fundamentally miscalculated. "How far to the settlement?" I asked. 20 kilometers, Douglas said. "We won't make it before dark." The forest was becoming more difficult to navigate as the light decreased. The path, never clearly defined, seemed to become even more uncertain. Douglas slowed the truck, peering intently through the windshield as twilight gathered around us. Then the truck stopped. Not because Douglas had braked, but because we'd hit something. Not a rock, not a fallen tree, but something that had deliberately placed itself in our path. There were 3 of them now. Not the ones that had stalked the cabin, but different forms, shapes that seemed to combine elements of various animals into configurations that nature had never intended. One bore the basic structure of a deer, but with the forelegs of a human, ending in hands rather than hooves. Another was almost wolf-shaped, but with a head that contained too many angles, as if it had been folded in dimensions our eyes couldn't quite track. The third was perhaps the most unsettling, roughly humanoid but wrong in every conceivable way, with proportions that seemed to shift slightly every time my focus settled on it. "Get out of the truck," Natalie whispered suddenly. We all turned to stare at her. "I'm serious," she said. "Get out, all of us, except Charles. Leave him inside." "Absolutely not," Carol said immediately. "You don't understand what they want," Natalie continued, and her voice had taken on a quality of absolute certainty. "They've been trying to tell us since we arrived. They're not interested in all of us. They're interested in me and my participation. I need to stop running and acknowledge it." Judith put a hand on Natalie's arm. "What do you mean, acknowledge it?" "My brother made a contract," Natalie said. "When he went outside, I think he did it to protect me, to give me a gift, to transfer something to me that the skinwalkers desired. And by running, by refusing to accept that gift, I'm violating the terms. They're going to kill all of us if I don't." "No," Benjamin said. "I'm not leaving anyone." "You don't have a choice," Natalie said. "None of you do. Douglas, you drove. Open the door." Something in her voice, a command that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her conscious mind, made Douglas reach for the door handle. He moved mechanically, his face a mask of conflict, but his hands obeyed. "Natalie," I began. She turned to me with eyes that were no longer quite her own. They held the same contempt, the same absolute absence of human empathy that I'd seen in the creatures surrounding us. "Thank you for being kind to my body," she said. And then she smiled, and I realized that nothing I'd thought was Natalie, nothing I'd believed was a human woman grieving her brother, had ever actually been human at all. She stepped out of the truck, and the creatures moved to receive her. As we watched in frozen horror, her form began to shift. Her skin took on qualities of leather and fur, her joints bent in directions that joints should not bend. But through it all, there was a sense of homecoming, as if she were finally expressing something that she'd been forced to contain in a human shape. The thing that had been wearing Natalie's body moved away from the truck with an easy grace, and the other creatures followed, disappearing into the forest as the last light of day drained from the sky. Douglas immediately accelerated, the truck lurching forward as he pressed the pedal to the floor. We drove with the headlights on full brightness, and Charles screamed from the back seat, not in fear but in some kind of ecstatic agony, as if the drug was wearing off and he was becoming aware of what was happening to his consciousness. We reached the settlement at full darkness, nearly midnight. Kotzebue's lights seemed impossibly bright, impossibly real after what we'd experienced. Douglas drove straight to the police station, and we stumbled out of the truck like refugees fleeing a war zone. The local authorities took our statement with increasing skepticism. 6 people arrived in a truck with 1 person missing, and our story involved creatures that shouldn't exist, psychological manipulation, and a woman who'd revealed herself to be something other than human. The official report, when we finally saw it days later, attributed our experience to acute stress syndrome and mass hallucination brought on by isolation and the unusual light conditions of the midnight sun. But Judith knew the truth. She'd documented it all in her journal, and in the weeks that followed, she worked on compiling her findings into something resembling a coherent account. What she eventually told us, what she admitted, more precisely, was that Natalie had been a skinwalker from the very beginning. Her brother probably was too, Judith explained in the hotel room where we'd been given shelter. They likely operate in family groups. The ritual of his disappearance, the way he went outside, that was probably the moment when he fully transitioned, when he stopped pretending to be human. But she lived a normal life, Carol said. A job, a family, a history. A cover, Judith said. Just as the forms they take are covers, the human skin is just another shape they wear. And she wore it for years, gathering intelligence, learning our patterns, our vulnerabilities. She was perfect for this expedition. She knew what her brother had discovered, what he'd become. She was waiting for the right moment to claim what she'd inherited. Charles never fully recovered. He was admitted to a psychiatric facility in Seattle, where he spent his remaining years, 2 years as it turned out, in a state of quiet dissociation, occasionally referring to the time the sky stopped being a boundary, and when I understood that everything I'd always thought was a lie. Benjamin burned his photographs. All of them. He claimed they were worthless, that the digital files had been corrupted, that he'd destroyed the negatives. But I suspect the truth was more complicated. I suspect he'd looked at those images closely enough to see what was really there. Not a creature mimicking an elk or a wolf, but something that existed partially outside conventional perception, and that perceiving it too clearly had damaged something in his ability to process reality. Douglas left Alaska within a month of our return. He sold his equipment, terminated his contracts, and disappeared into a region of Montana that makes Bethel look like Times Square by comparison. Before he left, he told me something that I've spent years trying to understand. "They were never hunting us," he said. "That's what I finally realized. They were recruiting. Natalie went inside that truck knowing what she was, and while she wore that form, while she walked among us as something almost human, she was changing us. We're all infected now, not biologically, but spiritually. Psychologically, we carry the marks of her presence." "Is that why you're leaving?" I asked. "It's why I can't stay near anyone," he replied. I never found Natalie Ramirez. Her apartment in Anchorage had been cleaned out the day we arrived back. Her job had been notified of her resignation through email. Her family, the family she'd claimed to have, didn't exist in any verifiable way. She was a phantom that had briefly solidified around us and then dispersed back into the spaces between things. Judith finished her book. It was published under a pseudonym by a press that specializes in folklore and indigenous studies. I've read it. It's the most thorough documentation I have of what actually happened in that cabin, in that forest, under the midnight sun of Alaska's most remote interior. But the book ends with a question that Judith was unable or unwilling to answer. If Natalie was always a skinwalker, always something inhuman wearing a human form, then what does that make the rest of us? What did we become the moment we allowed her to travel with us, to share our space, to integrate herself into our group? I still think about that question every time the sun begins to set, every time darkness gathers, every time I catch my reflection in a window and notice something slightly wrong about the proportions of my face. Because I'm not entirely certain I'm still myself, and I'm not sure I'd recognize it if I'd stopped being human somewhere in those forests near Bethel. Somewhere in that cabin surrounded by creatures that wear shapes like skin, somewhere in that impossible Alaskan night that refused to acknowledge the boundary between day and darkness.